Daniel Walker wiped the sweat from his brow as he stepped out of the firehouse. The cool evening air, a stark contrast to the sweltering heat of the day's work. His muscles ached, exhaustion creeping through his bones. But the moment he unlocked his truck and heard the familiar thud of paws against the pavement, a tired smile spread across his face. Apollo, his loyal German shepherd, was already waiting, tail wagging like a metronome, eyes locked on Daniel as if he had been gone for years rather than just a shift. The moment the door swung open, Apollo leaped into the passenger seat, his nose immediately pressing into Daniel's shoulder in greeting. Yeah, I missed you too, buddy," Daniel chuckled, scratching behind Apollo's ears as he started the engine. Driving home, Daniel let the rhythmic hum of the tires soothe him. His mind drifted, as it always did, to Olivia, the woman who had, against all odds, captured his heart. Olivia Bennett was everything he wasn't, structured, polished, and meticulous in a way that only someone who spent years climbing the corporate ladder could be. She was sharp, successful, and fiercely independent, and she hated dogs. Daniel sighed at the thought, his grip tightening on the wheel. He had known from the beginning that Olivia wasn't an animal person, but he had never expected the sheer intensity of her distaste for Apollo. It wasn't just mild discomfort. She actively avoided touching him, wrinkled her nose whenever he shed on her clothes, and refused to set foot in Daniel's house unless Apollo was locked outside. Apollo, for his part, seemed to sense Olivia's hostility. The usually friendly dog had never warmed up to her the way he did with others. He didn't jump on her excitedly when she walked in, didn't wag his tail in greeting. If anything, he would just sit and stare, unblinking, as if analyzing something Daniel couldn't quite understand. As they pulled into the driveway, Daniel turned to Apollo, sighing. "Maybe tonight will be different," he muttered, though he wasn't convinced. Olivia had agreed to come over for dinner, a rare occurrence considering how much she disliked being in Apollo's presence. Daniel had spent the last hour before his shift cleaning every trace of dog hair off the furniture, spraying air freshener, and making sure Apollo's bed was in the farthest corner of the house. He knew it was a lot of effort to go through just to make Olivia comfortable, but he loved her, and love, he figured, meant compromise. Inside, Apollo trotted to his water bowl while Daniel set the table. He checked his phone. Olivia had texted an hour ago saying she'd be late. He exhaled, rubbing a hand through his hair before heading to the kitchen to finish cooking. By the time Olivia finally arrived, Daniel could tell she was already on edge. Her navy blue blazer was slung over her arm, her white blouse pristine despite what must have been a long day at the firm. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes darting to Apollo, who sat obediently by the fireplace, watching her. "Did you lock him up?" she asked, setting her purse on the counter. Daniel stiffened but forced a neutral tone. "No, he's fine where he is." Olivia exhaled sharply, looking at the dog as if he were a landmine waiting to detonate. "You know how I feel about him being around while we eat, Daniel." "Liv, he's not going to do anything," Daniel said, moving toward her. "He's trained, he listens. He's part of my life. I wish you'd try to get used to him." She rolled her eyes. "You know I don't do dogs. They're unpredictable, they shed everywhere, and they smell." Daniel clenched his jaw. He had heard this argument a dozen times, but tonight it stung a little more than usual. Maybe because he had been hoping, deep down, that Olivia would come around, that she would see what he saw when he looked at Apollo. "Let's just eat," he muttered, pushing away the tension. Dinner passed with forced small talk. Olivia talked about work, her upcoming promotion, and the renovations in her apartment. Daniel listened, nodding in the right places, but his focus kept drifting to Apollo. The dog had been sitting unnaturally still the entire time, his dark eyes trained on Olivia, his ears twitching every time she shifted in her seat. When Olivia stood to grab a glass of water, Apollo moved too, swift and purposeful, his nose pressing against her stomach. "Jesus, Daniel," she shrieked, stumbling back, nearly knocking over her chair. "Get him off me." Apollo backed up instantly, ears pinned, but he didn't look guilty. He looked concerned. Daniel rushed to Olivia's side. "He didn't mean to. He jumped on me," she snapped, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "He didn't jump," Daniel corrected, voice tight. "He was sniffing." Olivia's eyes burned with anger. "I don't care what he was doing. I can't do this, Daniel. I can't live like this, walking on eggshells around that dog. If we're really thinking about a future together, something has to change. Daniel stared at her, his stomach sinking. You mean he has to go? She folded her arms. Yes, or I do. A heavy silence settled between them. Apollo let out a low whine from across the room. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat, looking between the two most important things in his life. One standing with her arms crossed, waiting for an answer, the other sitting patiently, eyes full of a silent understanding. And for the first time Daniel realized he might be forced to make an impossible choice. Daniel stood frozen in the silence that stretched between them, his heart hammering in his chest. Olivia's ultimatum hung heavy in the air, wrapping around him like chains tightening with every second that passed. Apollo, still sitting obediently by the fireplace, tilted his head slightly, his ears perked as if waiting for Daniel's response. Liv, Daniel started, his voice rough. You can't seriously be asking me to get rid of him. Olivia's arms remained tightly crossed, her expression cold, unmoving. I'm not asking, Daniel. I'm telling you, I can't live like this. I refuse to be in a house where I feel unsafe. Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. Unsafe? Olivia, Apollo isn't dangerous. He's never bitten anyone in his life. He's trained better than half the officers I work with. He wasn't attacking you, he was sniffing you. And that's supposed to make it better, she snapped. That's normal to you? Your dog jumps on me, and instead of taking my side, you defend him. What if next time he does more than just sniff? Daniel's jaw tightened. There won't be a next time because he wasn't attacking you in the first place. He gestured toward Apollo, whose eyes were locked onto Olivia in an almost eerie stillness. Look at him. He's sitting there, not growling, not barking. He's just watching. If he was aggressive, you'd know. Olivia shook her head, stepping back as if even standing near Apollo made her skin crawl. I can't, Daniel. I just can't. I told you from the beginning how I felt about dogs, and I've tried. Okay, I have. But I'm not going to spend my life waiting for the day he finally loses control. Daniel's stomach twisted. Loses control? He repeated incredulously. You make it sound like he's some kind of ticking time bomb. Olivia's face hardened. I don't trust him. I never will. If you want this to work, you need to choose me or the dog. Daniel took a slow breath, trying to suppress the anger bubbling inside him. He had always known Olivia didn't like dogs, but he had naively assumed over time that she would warm up to Apollo, that she would see what he saw. He had pictured their life together, a future where Olivia and Apollo coexisted, even if they were never close. But now, standing in his own kitchen, facing the woman he loved and the dog who had never left his side, he realized that wasn't going to happen. That's not fair, he finally said, voice low. You're making me choose between you and my best friend. Do you even hear how ridiculous that sounds? Olivia's expression wavered for the first time, her lips pressing into a thin line. Daniel, I love you. I do, but I can't do this. I can't pretend like I'm okay living with an animal when I'm not. And if we're really thinking about marriage, about kids one day, then you need to ask yourself what's more important to us or that dog. Daniel flinched at her words, something inside him cracking. He had imagined Olivia as his future. He had imagined building a life with her. But she had never pictured Apollo in that life. Only herself. Only him. Only what she deemed acceptable. You don't have to like him, he murmured. But can't you at least try to respect that he's part of my life? Olivia's eyes flickered with something, hesitation, maybe even regret. But it was fleeting. I can't, she said simply. I won't. The finality in her voice was like a punch to the gut. Daniel turned, exhaling sharply as he walked past her to the back door. He needed air, space, anything to clear his mind. Apollo stood instantly, his paws clicking against the floor as he followed without hesitation. The moment Daniel stepped outside, the crisp night air hit him like a wave. He rubbed his hands down his face, heart pounding, trying to make sense of everything. Apollo sat beside him, silent. He didn't need words. He never did. He just waited, ever patient, ever present. Daniel glanced down at him, swallowing hard. I don't know what to do, buddy. Apollo simply wagged his tail once, then nudged his nose against Daniel's arm. Daniel let out a quiet chuckle, despite himself. You really don't make this easy, huh? Inside, Olivia was probably pacing, waiting for his decision. But how could he decide? How could he throw away years of love for a woman who had become his world? How could he abandon the dog that had been with him through the hardest moments of his life? And yet, deep down, he knew, if Olivia really loved him, if she really wanted a life with him, she wouldn't be making him choose. She wouldn't be forcing him to pick between love and loyalty. The thought sent a pang through his chest. A soft whine from Apollo broke him from his thoughts. He looked down again, and for the first time that night, something strange occurred to him. Apollo was still staring at the door. Olivia had stormed through earlier. Not at Daniel, not at the sky, or the yard, at the door. And he wasn't just watching. His ears were perked, his body tense, his muscles slightly coiled like he was waiting for something. Something about the way Apollo looked at that door sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. It wasn't just that Olivia had upset him, it was something else, something Daniel couldn't put into words yet. But as Apollo let out a quiet, almost imperceptible growl, Daniel felt a strange, unsettling feeling settle into his gut. Because whatever it was, Apollo knew something Daniel didn't. Daniel spent the rest of the night on the porch, the cold biting through his jacket as Apollo remained steadfast beside him. His mind replayed Olivia's ultimatum over and over, each word hammering into his chest like a slow, deliberate drumbeat. But the unease that had settled in earlier, the way Apollo had watched the door so intently, the growl deep in his throat, lingered more than Olivia's words. It wasn't just her anger, it wasn't just his guilt, it was something else. Apollo had sensed something. Something Daniel had missed. He glanced down at his dog, now resting but still hyper-aware, ears flicking at every slight movement in the night. Apollo was never wrong about people. He had been Daniel's partner through thick and thin, trained to detect danger long before it arrived, and he had never reacted to Olivia this way before. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face, before standing. "Come on, boy. Let's go inside." Apollo hesitated for a moment before following him, his movements slow, calculated. As Daniel locked the door behind them, he felt the tension in his gut tighten. The air inside the house was still thick with Olivia's presence, the scent of her perfume still clinging to the couch where she had sat earlier. It felt off. For the first time, Daniel wasn't just thinking about their argument, he was thinking about what had set Apollo off. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring at his reflection in the darkened kitchen window. His mind was too restless for sleep, but his body ached with exhaustion. He needed clarity, and the only way to get it was to understand what Apollo was trying to tell him. He moved back to the living room and sat on the floor, motioning for Apollo to come closer. "All right, buddy, you've been acting weird for days now," Daniel murmured, scratching behind Apollo's ears. "I need you to help me understand. What is it about Olivia?" Apollo stared at him, his warm brown eyes filled with something deep, something knowing. Then, just like before, he turned toward the door. His nose twitched, his ears flicking forward. Daniel frowned. The door. Apollo didn't move for a moment. Then suddenly he let out a sharp exhale through his nose, shaking his head as if frustrated. He stood up, pacing in a small circle before stopping in front of the couch, where Olivia had been sitting hours ago. Then, slowly, he lowered his head and sniffed the air, focusing on the cushion she had leaned against. Daniel watched closely. That's where she was sitting earlier. Apollo continued sniffing, but this time, his focus narrowed. His movements became more purposeful, more insistent. He whined softly, his tail lowering. Then, just like before, he suddenly pressed his nose against the couch, right where Olivia's stomach had been. Daniel's chest tightened. "No way," he whispered. His heart began to pound. This wasn't random. Apollo had done this before, and not just tonight. The growling, the whining, the way he had fixated on Olivia's stomach. Dogs could smell sickness. They could sense things humans couldn't. Daniel had read stories before, canines detecting cancer in their owners, alerting them to tumors, long before doctors found them. But this, no, it couldn't be. And yet, as Apollo backed away from the couch and whined again, Daniel knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to talk to Olivia, even if she never wanted to see him again. Even if she thought he was crazy, he had to tell her. The next morning, Daniel barely waited for the sun to rise before grabbing his keys and heading out. Apollo whined as he reached for the door, as if he didn't want Daniel going anywhere alone. "I'll be back, boy," Daniel promised, rubbing the dog's head. "I need to fix this." He didn't call Olivia. He didn't text. He knew she wouldn't answer. Instead, he drove straight to her office building, gripping the wheel with enough force to make his knuckles go white. He hadn't planned out exactly what he would say, just that he had to say it. By the time he arrived, the city was already bustling, people weaving through traffic, taxis honking impatiently. Daniel barely noticed. He parked haphazardly and strode into the building, ignoring the confused stares from security as he made his way to the front desk. "I need to see Olivia Morgan," he told the receptionist. "It's urgent." The woman barely glanced up. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but then I'm afraid." "Daniel?" His head snapped up to see Olivia standing near the elevators, her brows furrowed in confusion. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept much either. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then, taking a deep breath, Daniel closed the distance between them. "Liv, we need to talk." Olivia sighed, rubbing her temple. "If this is about last night, I meant what I said." "It's not," he cut in, shaking his head. "Not exactly. This is about Apollo." Her expression darkened instantly. "Daniel, I told you, just listen," he pleaded. "Please, just for a minute." She hesitated, glancing around at the crowded lobby before sighing. "Fine, my office." They took the elevator in silence. The tension between them was thick, but Daniel didn't care about that right now. He cared about the unease growing in his gut, the way Apollo had reacted. Once they were in her office, Olivia crossed her arms. "All right, say what you need to say." Daniel took a breath, steadying himself. "I know this is going to sound insane, but Apollo's been acting weird around you. And not just last night, before that too. He keeps sniffing your stomach, whining, growling when you push him away." Olivia scoffed. "Yeah, because he hates me." "No," Daniel said firmly. "Because he's trying to tell us something." She frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "Daniel, what?" "Dogs can sense illnesses," he continued, not letting her interrupt. "They can smell things we can't. Cancer, infections, changes in body chemistry." Olivia's expression faltered. "What are you saying?" Daniel swallowed hard. "I'm saying you should see a doctor." She stared at him, like he had lost his mind. "You barged into my office to tell me that your dog thinks I have cancer." Daniel flinched at how ridiculous it sounded when she said it out loud, but he had seen Apollo's reactions. He had felt the fear deep in his bones. He couldn't ignore it. "I know how this sounds," he admitted. "But if I'm wrong, then fine. I'll never bring it up again. I just need you to get checked. Please." Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned toward her desk, as if considering how to respond. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she let out a slow breath. "Fine," she said. "I'll do it. Not because I believe you, but because I want this conversation to end." Daniel exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders. "That's all I ask." She turned back to him, her voice sharp. "And if everything comes back normal?" Daniel hesitated. "Then you'll never hear another word about it from me." Her eyes searched his, still laced with disbelief, but she finally nodded. "All right, I'll make an appointment." Daniel knew she didn't believe it, but he also knew Apollo wasn't wrong. And as he left her office, a cold dread settled in his stomach, because he had a feeling deep down that their lives were about to change forever. Daniel spent the next few days trying to push aside his unease, but it clung to him like a shadow. Every moment he wasn't at work, he was with Apollo, watching the dog closely, replaying the memory of Olivia's skeptical expression when she reluctantly agreed to see a doctor. He knew she didn't take him seriously. He knew she only did it to get him to drop the subject. But he couldn't, not when Apollo was still restless, still whining at the door every time he heard a car pass. Not when the pit in Daniel's stomach grew heavier by the day. He didn't hear from Olivia after their conversation. She hadn't called, hadn't texted. He tried not to read too much into it. She was a busy woman, and he had practically ambushed her at work. but something told him it wasn't just her busy schedule keeping her silent. Then, one evening his phone rang. It was her. Daniel's heart pounded as he answered. Olivia. Silence. Then a breath. Can you come over? Her voice was quiet. Almost too quiet. Daniel stood so fast that Apollo lifted his head in alarm. I'll be right there. The drive to Olivia's apartment felt unbearably long. Every red light, every slow driver in front of him, made his fingers tighten around the steering wheel. He didn't know what he was expecting, but the way she had sounded on the phone made his gut twist. By the time he pulled up outside her building, he was already pushing through worst-case scenarios in his mind. He took the stairs two at a time, not wanting to wait for the elevator, and when he knocked on her door, he barely gave her time to answer before calling out, Olivia, it's me. The lock clicked, and the door opened. She stood there, wrapped in a loose sweater, her normally sharp eyes dull with exhaustion. Her face was pale, her lips pressed together as if she was trying to keep herself from speaking. Daniel's stomach dropped. Come in, she murmured. He stepped inside, and immediately, Apollo would have sensed it, if he were here. The energy was heavy, the silence thick with something unspoken. Olivia walked ahead of him, into the living room, where a small stack of papers sat on her coffee table. She didn't sit, she just stood there, arms crossed, staring at the papers as if they might disappear if she looked away. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears. Liv, I have cancer. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Daniel's breath caught, the room tilting for just a second as his mind tried to catch up. She exhaled shakily, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. Early-stage ovarian cancer. The doctor said that if I hadn't come in when I did, it probably wouldn't have been caught for at least another year. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips. I only went because you and that damn dog wouldn't leave me alone about it. Daniel barely heard the last part. His mind was still trying to process the first. Cancer. She had cancer. His throat tightened. Liv. I don't. She shook her head, blinking rapidly. Don't say anything yet. I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about this. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat, nodding slowly. Okay. A moment of silence stretched between them. Then Olivia let out a breath, her voice quieter. I don't even know why I called you. Daniel did. Because despite everything, despite the fights, despite Apollo, despite the way they had nearly torn each other apart, deep down, she knew he would be here. He took a step closer, hesitant but firm. You're not doing this alone. She gave a tired scoff. Daniel, you're not. His voice was steady. You have me. And whether you like it or not, you have Apollo too. Something flickered in her eyes at the mention of his dog. Guilt, because she had been so sure he was the problem, that he was nothing more than a nuisance. But Apollo had been right. She slowly lowered herself onto the couch, staring at the papers on the table. I have treatment options, she murmured. The doctors think they caught it early enough to avoid the worst of it. Daniel sat beside her, not too close, just close enough. That's good, he said softly. She nodded, but her expression was distant. I've spent years being so in control of my life, and now, I feel like I have no control at all. Daniel hesitated, then reached for her hand. You don't have to have all the answers right now. For the first time that night, Olivia met his gaze, and for once, there was no anger, no defiance, just quiet uncertainty. Then, after a long pause, she squeezed his hand back. Daniel let out a slow breath, relief washing through him. This wasn't going to be easy, but they would figure it out, together. Daniel didn't go home that night. Olivia didn't ask him to stay. But she didn't ask him to leave either. They sat together in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of her diagnosis settling between them like an unspoken agreement. Things had changed. Forever. It wasn't until well past midnight that Olivia finally stood, rubbing her temples as exhaustion threatened to pull her under. I should sleep, she murmured. Daniel nodded, standing as well. Yeah. She hesitated, glancing toward the door, as if debating whether to send him away. Instead, she let out a breath and said, You can take the couch. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As she disappeared into her bedroom, Daniel pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to his neighbor, asking if they could check in on Apollo in the morning. The thought of his dog pacing alone in his house, still sensing that something was wrong, gnawed at him. He had never spent a night away from Apollo, not since he had brought him home as a pup, but Olivia needed him now, and he wasn't going anywhere. Morning came too quickly. Daniel woke up to the sound of Olivia moving around in the kitchen. When he sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he found her standing at the counter, staring at the coffee machine like she had forgotten how to use it. "You okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse from sleep. She didn't turn around. "I feel like I should be freaking out more," she admitted. "But I just feel numb." Daniel moved to stand beside her. He reached for the coffee pot and took over, measuring the grounds, pouring the water. The familiarity of the routine grounded him, and from the way Olivia simply stood there and let him do it, he figured she needed that too. "Maybe it hasn't sunk in yet," he offered. She scoffed. "Yeah, give it time." They sat at the small kitchen table with their coffee, the steam curling between them in the quiet. Olivia took slow sips, staring into the dark liquid like it might hold answers. Daniel, on the other hand, was trying to figure out how to bring up what had been weighing on his mind all night. Finally, he just said it. "I think you should move in." Olivia's head snapped up. "What?" "I think you should stay with me," he repeated. "Just for now, for the treatments. You shouldn't be alone through this." Olivia frowned, setting down her mug. "I'm not helpless, Daniel. I never said you were." His voice was calm, steady. "But you shouldn't have to go through this by yourself." She crossed her arms. "I have people." "Who?" he challenged gently. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her parents were out of state, her brother across the country. Her co-workers were more acquaintances than friends. Olivia had always been independent, always kept people at a distance, and now it was coming back to haunt her. She inhaled sharply. "I'll figure it out." Daniel shook his head. "You don't have to." She was silent for a long time. Then finally her shoulders dropped. "If I move in," Daniel already knew what she was going to say. "Apollo stays." Her lips pressed into a tight line. "He's part of this," Daniel said firmly. "I'm not asking you to suddenly love him. I'm asking you to tolerate him." She sighed, looking away. Daniel softened his voice. "He saved your life, Liv. That was what did it." He saw it in her face, the way those words knocked the wind out of her. The realization, the weight of it. She swallowed, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug. "I still don't like dogs," she muttered. Daniel gave her a small, knowing smile. "I know." A pause. Then reluctantly she said, "Fine." Daniel exhaled, relieved. "Okay." She shook her head, taking another sip of coffee. "I can't believe I'm doing this." He grinned. "Me neither." By the time Daniel pulled into his driveway later that afternoon, Olivia sitting stiffly in the passenger seat, he could see Apollo waiting at the window. The moment the car stopped, the dog disappeared from view, and seconds later the sound of scratching at the front door filled the air. Olivia tensed. Daniel sighed. "He's excited." "Great." He shot her a look. "Olivia." She huffed. "I'm trying." That was the most he was going to get, and he knew it. So he climbed out, grabbing her bags from the back seat, and unlocked the door. The moment it swung open, Apollo was there, tail wagging furiously, tongue hanging out in pure joy. Daniel knelt, rubbing behind his ears. "Hey buddy, I missed you too," Apollo whined, pressing against him. But his ears flicked toward Olivia almost immediately. His head tilted as he sniffed the air, that same intense focus returning. Olivia took a hesitant step inside. "No jumping," she warned. Apollo didn't jump. He just sat there, staring at her. For a second Olivia didn't move. Then slowly, hesitantly, she lifted a hand. She didn't touch him, just held it out, palm facing downward, like she had seen people do with dogs before. Apollo sniffed it. Then, in a move that surprised them both, he simply turned and trotted away, as if satisfied. Daniel chuckled. "Guess he's giving you space." Olivia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Good. But Daniel had seen it. That moment, that flicker of something when she had reached out. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night Daniel woke to the sound of scratching. His first thought was Apollo. Maybe he needed to go outside. But when he sat up and looked toward the door, he found Apollo lying at the foot of the bed, fast asleep. The scratching came again. It was coming from Olivia's room. Frowning, Daniel got up, moving quietly down the hall. When he reached the door he hesitated before knocking softly. Liv, no answer. Another scratch. Without thinking, he pushed the door open. And there she was, sitting on the floor, back against the bed, knees pulled to her chest. Apollo sat beside her, watching her intently. Daniel's stomach twisted. Olivia, he murmured. She looked up. Her eyes were red. She had been crying. For a moment, she looked like she was going to snap at him, tell him to go away. But then her expression crumpled. I'm scared. The words were so quiet, so raw that Daniel barely heard them. But Apollo did. He moved closer, pressing his nose to her arm. And for the first time since all of this started, Olivia didn't push him away. She let him stay. Daniel walked over and sat beside her. He didn't speak. He just placed a hand over hers, feeling her tremble. And together, in the quiet of the night, they sat, the weight of everything settling in. But this time, Olivia wasn't alone. That morning, Daniel woke up to the smell of coffee brewing and the faint sound of Apollo's paws clicking against the hardwood floors. He sat up, stretching, his body still sore from sleeping on the floor in Olivia's room. He hadn't planned on staying there all night, but after she had finally drifted off, head resting against Apollo's side, he hadn't been able to bring himself to leave. Now, as he stepped into the kitchen, he found Olivia standing at the counter, her back to him, her hair messily tied up in a bun. She was staring down at her coffee mug, unmoving, lost in thought. Apollo sat beside her, his head tilted slightly, as if he was watching over her. Daniel grabbed a mug and poured himself some coffee. You sleep at all? Olivia let out a breath. Not really. He didn't push. Instead, they stood there in silence, sipping their coffee, the morning light streaming in through the windows. It was a strange kind of quiet, heavy, but not suffocating. Finally, Olivia set her cup down. I have my first oncology appointment today. Daniel nodded, already knowing. He had checked her calendar the night before while she slept, not because he didn't trust her to go, but because he wanted to be prepared. I'll drive you, he said. She hesitated. I can go alone. I know you can, he said simply. But you don't have to. She stared at him for a long moment before sighing. Fine. And just like that, another wall came down. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. Olivia sat stiffly in the chair beside Daniel, her fingers gripping the armrests, her knuckles white. Apollo wasn't allowed inside, so Daniel had left him in the car with the windows cracked, though he knew the dog was probably whining, restless without her. She hadn't spoken much since they arrived. Daniel had offered her a magazine, a distraction. She had ignored it. He had asked if she wanted to talk. She had shaken her head. He understood. He wasn't good at waiting either. The nurse finally called her name. Olivia stood, smoothing out the non-existent wrinkles in her sweater. Her movements were stiff, deliberate, as if she were trying to hold herself together with sheer willpower. She turned to Daniel, hesitating. I'll be here, he said softly. She nodded once, then followed the nurse down the hall. Daniel watched her go, his jaw tightening. This was only the beginning. The appointment lasted nearly 2 hours. When Olivia finally emerged, her expression was unreadable. Daniel stood immediately, searching her face for any sign of how it went. She said nothing, just walked past him, straight to the exit. Daniel followed. The second they stepped outside, Olivia inhaled sharply, as if she had been holding her breath the entire time. Then she stopped. Apollo was waiting. The moment he saw her, he perked up, tail wagging, ears twitching. He let out a low whine, standing up on his hind legs slightly, pawing at the window. Daniel opened the door. Apollo jumped out immediately, but instead of running to Daniel, he went straight to Olivia, and for the first time she didn't flinch. She let him press his nose against her stomach, let him whine softly, as he circled her once, then twice, before finally sitting at her feet, staring up at her, as if he were waiting. Daniel watched, holding his breath. Olivia looked down at him, then slowly, she crouched. Her hands hovered over his fur, uncertain, and then finally, she touched him. It was hesitant at first, just a light brush of her fingertips against his head. But Apollo stayed still, sensing her uncertainty, letting her set the pace. Her fingers sank into his fur. Apollo let out a soft sigh, and closed his eyes. And just like that, something inside Olivia seemed to crack. A tremble ran through her shoulders, and before she could stop herself, She was crying. Daniel stepped forward, ready to pull her into his arms. But before he could, she buried her face into Apollo's fur. Apollo didn't move, didn't pull away. He just sat there, letting her cry, letting her fall apart. Daniel swallowed past the lump in his throat. She wasn't just breaking down, she was letting go, and for the first time since all of this started, Olivia wasn't trying to hold herself together. She was allowing herself to be held. The drive home was quiet. Olivia had stopped crying by the time they reached the house, though her eyes were still red-rimmed, her shoulders tense. Daniel parked the car but didn't move. Olivia didn't either. Her fingers toyed with the fabric of her jeans, her jaw tight. "I start treatment next week," she finally said. Daniel exhaled. "Okay." Another long pause. Then she turned to him. "You don't have to do this, you know." Daniel frowned. "Do what?" "Be here," she said. "I know you feel responsible, because of Apollo, but you don't have to." "Olivia." She closed her mouth. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "You think I'm only here because of Apollo?" She looked away. He let out a humorless laugh. "Jesus live. I was in love with you long before this." Her breath caught. Daniel shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere. Not because I have to, because I want to." Olivia's eyes glistened. But she didn't argue, and that was all the answer he needed. That night, Olivia didn't cry. She still didn't talk much, still carried herself like she was walking through a minefield. But she let Apollo lay beside her on the couch, as she read through the pamphlets the doctor had given her. Daniel didn't hover, didn't press. He just sat across from her, watching as Apollo slowly nudged closer, until his head rested against her leg. And Olivia didn't push him away. She just exhaled, and let him stay. That morning, Olivia woke up feeling exhausted before the day had even begun. Her entire body ached, not from sickness, not from treatment yet, but from the weight of what was coming. She lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the world outside, the faint rustling of trees, birds chirping in the distance, and downstairs, the quiet tap of Apollo's paws against the hardwood floor. She knew he was waiting for her, and for once, she didn't dread it. With a slow, steadying breath, she sat up, ran a hand through her tangled hair, and pulled herself out of bed. Apollo was at the bottom of the stairs, ears perked up the second he saw her. His tail thumped against the floor, a soft but eager rhythm, his brown eyes locked onto hers. Something inside her softened. "Morning," she murmured. Apollo's tail wagged faster. Daniel stepped out of the kitchen, a mug of coffee in his hand. "You okay?" Olivia nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was entirely true. "I'm fine." Daniel didn't call her out on it, just nodded and passed her the extra mug he had already made for her. She took it without question. This was their new normal. For now, her first chemotherapy session was tomorrow. She could feel it looming over her, a quiet, insidious presence in the back of her mind. Daniel had offered to take the day off work to be there, but she told him no, insisted that she was fine going alone. She could tell he didn't believe her, but he didn't argue. Instead, he spent the day keeping things normal. Casual conversation, light jokes, letting her have space without making her feel alone. And Apollo was never far away. She didn't know when it had happened, when she had stopped flinching whenever he got close, when his presence stopped feeling invasive and started feeling grounding. Now, when she sat on the couch, he laid his head on her lap like it was the most natural thing in the world, and for once, she let herself rest. That evening, Olivia stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. Tomorrow, everything would change. She would begin a process that would take everything from her, her strength, her energy, maybe even her hair. She had spent so much of her life in control, independent, capable, and now, she was about to become someone she didn't recognize. A hand suddenly rested on her shoulder. She startled, turning to find Daniel standing there, his expression unreadable. "I called the clinic," he said. Her stomach twisted. "Why?" "Because I'm coming with you." She shook her head. "Daniel, I know you don't want me there," he said, voice calm but firm. "But I'm not letting you do this alone." She exhaled, staring down at the sink, fingers gripping the counter. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she was strong enough, but the words wouldn't come, because for the first time, She wasn't sure she was. Okay, she whispered. Daniel let out a slow breath, then reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't pull away. Apollo curled up on the foot of the bed that night. He wasn't usually allowed in the bedroom, but Olivia didn't say a word when he jumped up and laid beside her feet. Maybe, deep down, she didn't want to be alone. And Apollo somehow knew that. As she drifted off to sleep, Daniel sitting beside her, Apollo resting close, she felt something strange. Not hope, not yet, but something close, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe she didn't have to go through this alone, after all. The next morning, the world felt different, quieter, heavier. Olivia moved through her morning routine in a haze, brushing her teeth, showering, pulling on clothes that felt both too big and too tight all at once. Every motion felt weighted, like she was moving through thick water, each step dragging her closer to something inevitable. When she stepped into the kitchen, Daniel was already there. 2 mugs of coffee on the counter, a bag packed with snacks, and a water bottle. Apollo sat by the door, ears alert, tail still, watching. You ready? Daniel asked softly. Olivia hesitated. No, she admitted. Daniel nodded like he expected that answer. That's okay. He reached for her coat, helped her slide into it, and led her to the car. Apollo whined softly as they stepped outside. Olivia paused, glancing down at him. I'll be back, she murmured. Apollo tilted his head, his eyes searching hers, and then, as if satisfied, he finally sat down. She wasn't sure if it was a promise or a plea. The drive to the hospital was silent, save for the sound of the road beneath them. Daniel glanced at her every few minutes, but he didn't push, didn't try to fill the silence with empty words or forced reassurances. She appreciated that. By the time they pulled into the parking lot, Olivia's fingers had curled so tightly into her palms that she had to force them open, stretching them against the fabric of her jeans. Daniel turned off the engine but didn't move to get out. Instead, he reached over, his fingers resting lightly over hers. You're not alone in this, he said quietly. Olivia swallowed, staring down at their hands. For a moment, she let herself believe him. Then she exhaled, nodded, and opened the door. The waiting room was sterile and cold. Everything smelled like antiseptic and something else, something metallic, like fear and finality. Other patients sat scattered throughout, some wearing scarves over their heads, some slumped in their chairs, others staring blankly at the walls. Olivia wondered if she'd look like them soon. A nurse called her name, and Daniel squeezed her hand as they stood. Step by step, she walked forward. The IV line was in place before she fully registered it. She had expected pain, had braced for it, but it was the absence of feeling that made her breath catch. A quiet, sinking realization. This was it. It had begun. Daniel sat beside her, flipping through a magazine, pretending like everything was normal. But she could see the tension in his jaw, the way he kept checking her face, watching for signs of discomfort. And then, after a few minutes, he set the magazine down. You want to talk about something else? He asked. She let out a dry, humorless laugh. Like what? Anything, he shrugged. Work. That weird neighbor of yours. What kind of dog Apollo reminds you of? Olivia huffed, shaking her head. I don't know, like one of those old warriors in movies. Daniel smirked. You mean like a retired general? Yeah, she said, eyes drifting. Like he's seen things. Been through battles. Daniel leaned back, thoughtful. Maybe he has. For a moment the sterile room faded. She closed her eyes and pictured Apollo at home, curled up by the door, waiting. Always waiting. Maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about him. Hours passed. By the time the session was over, Olivia felt drained in a way she had never known before. Every muscle, every inch of her skin, felt heavier. Daniel helped her into the car, drove her home, without a word. When they pulled into the driveway, Apollo was there, sitting at the door, waiting. His tail wagged once, tentatively, as she stepped out of the car. When she sank onto the couch, barely making it inside, Apollo moved closer. Then, for the first time, she reached out, and he let her. fur beneath her fingers, warmth pressing against her leg. Olivia finally, let herself lean on something other than her own strength. Maybe she didn't have to do this alone. Not anymore. The days blurred together. The hospital visits, the medication, the exhaustion that never seemed to fade. Olivia thought she knew what it meant to be tired before, but this was something else. A bone-deep weariness, a fog that settled over her mind and body, making even the simplest tasks feel impossible. Daniel was always there, always driving her to appointments, making sure she ate, pretending not to notice when she barely touched her food. And Apollo never left her side. She didn't know when it happened, when the big, imposing dog she once resented became her greatest comfort. He followed her from room to room, lying just close enough that she could reach out and touch him if she wanted to. And at night, when the nausea kept her curled up on the bathroom floor, he was there too, resting his head on his paws, watching. He never whined, never tried to leave, just waited, just like before. One evening, as Olivia sat curled under a blanket on the couch, Apollo lifted his head suddenly, ears perking up. A second later, the doorbell rang. Olivia frowned. Daniel glanced at her. Expecting someone, she shook her head. He stood, crossing the room, Apollo close behind him. The dog's posture was tense, alert. When Daniel opened the door, a familiar figure stood on the porch. Isabel. Her blonde hair was tied back, her expensive coat fitted perfectly around her frame, and yet, there was something different about her, something hesitant. "Olivia," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I wanted to see you." Olivia stiffened. Her sister had barely called since the diagnosis. A few texts here and there, but nothing substantial. No visits, no real support. Now suddenly, she was here. "Why?" Olivia asked, her voice flat. Isabel hesitated, glancing at Daniel before turning her attention back to Olivia. "I should have been here sooner," she admitted. "I know that. I didn't know what to say." Olivia swallowed, the familiar ache of disappointment creeping in. "And now you do." "I don't." Isabel's voice was quiet. "But I don't want that to be an excuse anymore." The silence stretched between them. Then Apollo, still watching, took a step forward. He sniffed the air, studying Isabel with those sharp, knowing eyes. And for the first time in her life, Olivia found herself trusting his judgment more than her own. She exhaled, sinking further into the couch. "Come in," she said. Isabel stepped inside. The tension in the room was thick. Isabel sat stiffly in the armchair across from Olivia, her hands folded in her lap. Apollo stayed close to Olivia, his massive head resting on her knee. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," Isabel started. "I was selfish. I should have been here." Olivia scoffed. "No argument there." Isabel flinched but nodded. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to be here now." Olivia stared at her, searching for any sign of insincerity. She wasn't sure if she found one. Daniel, sensing the weight of the conversation, stood. "I'll get some tea." Isabel let out a breath. "I really wasn't sure you'd even let me in." "Me neither," Olivia admitted. She glanced at Apollo, who had relaxed, just slightly. That was good enough for her. Isabel's gaze drifted to the dog. "I see you finally stopped pretending you don't like him." Olivia smirked, running a hand over Apollo's fur. "Turns out, he's impossible to ignore." "Sounds familiar," Isabel muttered, a small, almost fond smile playing on her lips. For the first time in years, Olivia saw a glimpse of the sister she used to know, and maybe, just maybe, she was willing to let her in, even if it was just a little. That night, after Isabel left, Olivia sat in bed, staring at the ceiling. Apollo lay at her feet, his slow, steady breathing filling the quiet room. She thought about the past few months, the fear, the exhaustion, the anger, and the things she never expected. Like Daniel, like Apollo, like the way her sister had finally shown up. She reached down, fingers brushing against Apollo's thick coat. His tail wagged, just once. "You knew, didn't you?" she murmured. Apollo let out a deep sigh, closing his eyes. Olivia smiled faintly. Maybe she didn't have to do this alone after all. The night was cool, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth, as the campfire crackled in front of them. Oliver leaned back against Daniel, wrapped in a thick blanket, his fingers tracing lazy circles on Apollo's fur. It had been months since his illness, and though his body still bore the marks of the battle, he felt more alive than he had in years. Away from the noise of the city, surrounded by towering trees and endless sky, this felt like a fresh start. Apollo, ever watchful, sat beside them, his ears twitching at every distant rustle in the underbrush. His presence was comforting, a constant source of warmth and safety. "We should do this more often," Oliver murmured, tilting his head back to look at Daniel. Daniel smiled, pressing a soft kiss to Oliver's forehead. "Yeah, we should." It was a rare moment of peace, one they didn't realize was about to be shattered. The next morning, the forest was alive with movement, birds flitting between branches, squirrels darting up trees, and Apollo, ever curious, prowling just beyond the campsite. Oliver was gathering firewood when he saw it, a flash of white tail vanishing into the undergrowth. A rabbit. Before he could react, Apollo bolted after it. "Apollo, no," Oliver called, dropping the wood. Daniel, hearing the commotion, turned sharply. "What happened?" He ran off. It should have been fine. Apollo always came back. He was smart, well-trained, and never strayed too far. But minutes passed, then hours, and Apollo never returned. The first night without Apollo was unbearable. Oliver barely slept, his mind replaying every possible scenario. Had Apollo gotten stuck somewhere? Had he been attacked by a wild animal? He had to be out there, scared, and trying to find his way back. "We'll find him," Daniel promised, squeezing Oliver's hand. "He's tough." But worry gnawed at Oliver's insides. Apollo was tough, but the wilderness was unforgiving. Days turned into weeks. They searched the forest tirelessly, calling Apollo's name until their voices were hoarse. They left food out, set up makeshift shelters in case he found his way back. They printed flyers and drove to nearby towns, asking locals if they had seen a lost German shepherd. There was nothing. Oliver refused to give up, but the hope in his eyes grew dimmer with each passing day. Lost in the vast wilderness, Apollo had quickly realized his mistake. The rabbit had led him deep into unfamiliar territory. By the time he lost sight of it, the scent of the campsite was gone, replaced by the overwhelming mix of damp leaves, soil, and the sharp musk of unknown creatures. He wandered for days, hunger clawing at his stomach. He found water in a stream, but food was harder. He learned to scavenge, catching small rodents when he could, digging up roots when he couldn't. One night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, the rain coming down in relentless sheets. Apollo curled up beneath an outcropping of rock, shivering as lightning split the sky. Then came the wolves. He heard them before he saw them. The low growls, the rustling in the bushes. His body went rigid, ears flat against his head. They were watching him. When they attacked, it was fast and brutal. Snarls filled the air as Apollo fought, his teeth sinking into fur and flesh. Claws raked his side, pain flaring like fire, but he refused to go down. He snapped at a second attacker, dodged a lunge from a third. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the wolves backed off. They had underestimated him. He wasn't just another lost dog. He was a fighter, and he had something to fight for. Wounded but alive, Apollo pressed on. Months passed in a blur of survival. He grew leaner, his fur matted with dirt and blood. His paws were raw from miles of walking, but he never stopped moving. He had to find his way home. 3 months later, the storm rain pounded against the windows, the wind rattling the trees outside. Oliver lay curled up on the sofa, shivering beneath a thick blanket. He had caught a cold, his body exhausted from searching for Apollo, from standing outside for hours in the rain, from hoping when there was no hope left. Daniel sat at the table, organizing the last batch of missing dog flyers. Neither of them spoke. Then, a sound cut through the storm. A bark. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. The barking came again, louder this time. Desperate, Oliver sat up so fast the blanket fell from his shoulders. His heart pounded as he scrambled off the couch. Stumbling toward the door, Daniel was already there, flinging it open, and there he was. Apollo, drenched, battered, covered in mud and blood. His fur clung to his thin frame. His legs wobbled with exhaustion. But his eyes, those deep, familiar eyes, were filled with relief. He had made it home. Oliver let out a broken sob, dropping to his knees as Apollo staggered toward him. He wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in Apollo's wet fur, his body shaking with tears. "You found your way back," Oliver whispered, voice trembling. "You came home." Apollo let out a tired whimper, nuzzling into Oliver's embrace. Daniel knelt beside them, running his hands over Apollo, checking his wounds. "We need to get him warm, get him checked out." But for that moment, nothing else mattered. Apollo had survived. He had fought through the impossible, and he had come home. Oliver pulled back just enough to cup Apollo's face, pressing his forehead against the dog's. "I never stopped looking for you," he murmured. Apollo licked his face, a silent reassurance. Neither of them had ever given up. Daniel exhaled shakily, watching the reunion with tears in his eyes. And for the first time in months, the weight in Oliver's chest lifted. They were whole again, together, and nothing would ever tear them apart.